Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today at the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. My name is Rupal Mehta, and I'm a senior fellow at the center, and I'll be moderating the lecture today entitled Assessing Europe's Bad Nuclear Options. It is my pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Tobias Bunde. Dr. Bunde is a professor of international security at the Hertie School, as well as the director of research and policy at the Munich Security Conference and a member of the executive board of the Munich Security Conference Foundation. Tobias studied international relations at a variety of institutions in Germany, France, and the United States, and received his PhD in political science from the Freie Universität Berlin. Since February 2024, Dr. Bunde has served as the co-chair with James Davis and Claudia Major of the Europe Nuclear Security Group, a joint initiative of the Munich Security Conference, the Center for International Security at the Hertie School, and the Institute of Political Science at the University of St. Gallen. In today's talk, Tobias is going to explore the evolving security environment in Europe. In recent years, Russia's nuclear-backed revisionism has reintroduced nuclear coercion and the threat of nuclear escalation to the conflict, underscoring the importance of credible nuclear deterrence. At the same time, Europe's traditional reliance on the United States' extended nuclear deterrent appears politically more fragile than at any point since the Cold War. Together, these developments require Europeans to think about their nuclear options more concretely. Based on the report of the European Nuclear Security Group presented at the Munich Security Conference just this past year in February 2026, this lecture provides an overview of the ongoing European debate on the nuclear deterrence and various options that pundits and policymakers alike have put forward in the public debate, ranging from continued reliance on the U.S. extended nuclear deterrent, strengthening the role of British and French nuclear forces in European deterrence, developing a common European deterrent, and pursuing new independent national nuclear deterrents, to investing in conventional deterrence without a nuclear component. However the uncomfortable debate might be, Dr. Bunde argues that the new security environment requires European policymakers to confront the role of nuclear weapons in the defense of the continent directly and without delay, and to invest the necessary resources needed to do so competently. This talk will follow the format of other CGSR seminars. Dr. Bunde will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will start the Q&A. During his talk, please feel free to get your questions ready, and you can start raising your hands electronically or by typing questions into the chat while he is speaking. Thank you so much, Tobias, for joining us today, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Shupal. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm looking forward to talking to you and to also receiving your feedback, your questions afterwards. I'm gonna share my slides and then I'll walk you through the talk, and you should see my slides anytime now. As Rupal already mentioned, my presentation is mostly based on the report of the European Nuclear Study Group, Mind the Deterrence Gap, Assessing Europe's Nuclear Options, which we presented at this year's Munich Security Conference, and which you can download from the MSC website. Here's the bibliographical information that I will also share at the end. But let me first begin with a few words about the study group itself, because this is also important for understanding what we tried to do and also what we did not try to do. So the European Nuclear Study Group was established in 2024 as a joint initiative, as Rupal already said, of the Munich Security Conference, the Center for International Security at the Hertie School, and the Institute of Political Science at the University of St. Gallen, jointly chaired by James Davis, Claudia Major, and me. It has been supported by an endowment from the Stanton Foundation to the Hertie School and the Munich Security Conference, as well as by the University of St. Gallen. And the background is simply that a few years ago, Claudia, James, and I had all been thinking about setting up a group of European scholars and think tankers to discuss the implications of what we describe as a new nuclear age in Europe. So we decided to join forces and bring together a group of European and Europe-based experts to think through the many challenges Europe is facing as a whole. And from the very beginning, the focus was on Europe, not on individual countries. This was important to us because the existing debate was often nationally compartmentalized. We wanted a pan-European discussion, not about what might be optimal for just one country, but about what Europe as a whole would need to do in a much more demanding nuclear environment. And we wanted to do this in a way that strengthened rather than weakened the transatlantic partnership. In a sense, we wanted to work on what you could call the European pillar of the transatlantic debate on nuclear deterrence. So our common starting point was essentially a shared sense of frustration. Because over the past few years, especially since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and then again with renewed doubts about the reliability of the United States, European discussions about nuclear deterrence have often been characterized by rather superficial proposals. Here are just a few examples of newspaper articles, public opinion polls, TV shows, or interviews with politicians calling for seemingly easy solutions to a very difficult problem. Some people would say Europe needs its own bomb without discussing who would decide on its use or what would be required for a credible deterrent at the European level. Some even suggested that the bigger EU states could have a nuclear football, which would be passed from one capital to another on a rotational basis. Others would just say, oh, France should simply extend its nuclear umbrella, as if Europe could simply switch umbrellas and France could easily assume the role of the United States, ignoring the limits of French capabilities, strategic culture, and doctrine. And others suggested that Germany or Poland could go nuclear, often ignoring the tremendous legal, political, and military hurdles on the way to a credible national deterrent. And yet others argued that Europe should avoid the nuclear issue altogether and simply invest in conventional capabilities. Now, all these ideas point to real concerns, but too often they were presented as if they were simple solutions to a simple problem, as if possessing a nuclear warhead were the same thing as having deterrence. And of course, our view was that this is misleading. The public debate in Europe was the symptom of a real problem, but much of the debate was not yet helpful. It mostly revolved around pseudo solutions and remained superficial, stopping just short of the really difficult questions and trade-offs. So what we wanted to do with the European Nuclear Study Group was to bring more structure into this debate and to write a report that targeted regular members of parliament with some background knowledge, but not a lot. So this is the target audience of the report. And we wanted to take the ideas already circulating in European policy circles and ask systematically, what would they actually require? How credible would they be? How feasible would they be? And what political, financial, legal, and strategic risks would they entail? So in other words, we did not set out to advocate one preferred option. We set out to evaluate the options Europe is already discussing and to make the trade-offs more explicit. And that is why the report assesses 5 options. First, doubling down on US extended nuclear deterrence. Second, a stronger role for British and French nuclear forces in European deterrence. Third, the development of a common European deterrent. Fourth, the acquisition of new independent national nuclear arsenals. And fifth, a focus on conventional deterrence without a nuclear component. And the central conclusion is uncomfortable. None of these options is a good one. But the fact that all options are bad does not mean that Europeans can avoid exploring them. Avoiding the debate is itself a strategic choice and probably the most dangerous one. That is the argument I want to develop today, and I will proceed in 3 steps. So first, I will briefly sketch the double challenge that, in our view, has brought Europe into this new nuclear era. Russia's nuclear-backed revisionism and growing doubts about the long-term reliability of US extended deterrence. Second, I will walk through the 5 options and discuss their main strengths and weaknesses. And third, I will conclude with the broader point, saying that Europe has no easy way out of its nuclear predicament, but has to start thinking seriously about these bad options now, before strategic circumstances force Europeans to make decisions under much worse conditions. There were some disagreements about the credibility and feasibility of specific options in the group, but overall, this is our joint assessment. So our report starts from the claim that Europe, just like the world in general, has entered a new nuclear era. Europeans, however, have been slow in recognizing it. For roughly 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, nuclear deterrence was not absent from European security thinking, but it moved to the background. NATO continued to rely on nuclear deterrence, but it did not spend a lot of time discussing nuclear strategy. The United States continued to provide extended nuclear deterrence. France and the United Kingdom maintained the independent nuclear forces, nuclear sharing continued, but for many European policymakers, nuclear deterrence became something like a residual category. When there was a public debate, it was mostly about whether Europe still needed forward-deployed US non-strategic weapons on European soil, whether nuclear sharing would work without them. So the first assumption at the time was that large-scale war in Europe, and certainly nuclear coercion in Europe, had become highly unlikely. Russia's annexation of Crimea raised some doubts, but Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022 destroyed that assumption. And Russia's repeated nuclear threats since the beginning of the full-scale war show that nuclear weapons are not merely background capabilities. For Moscow, they are strategic tools. And the second assumption was that Europe could continue to rely on the United States as the ultimate guarantor of European security and in a way outsource its thinking about nuclear deterrence to its patron. That assumption has not disappeared, but it has become politically more fragile. And we argue that Europeans can no longer take for granted that US extended deterrence will remain as reliable, as politically uncontested, and as strategically available as it used to be. And taken together, these two shifts could lead to a deterrence gap. And by deterrence gap, we mean a situation in which Europe's adversaries perceive a mismatch between Europe's interests and Europe's ability or willingness to defend them. And this deterrence gap is not simply, of course, a material shortfall. It's not only a question of warheads, delivery systems, or defense budgets. It's also about perceptions, about what Russia believes Europe and the United States would actually do in a crisis. And that is why we think that Europeans need to confront the issue now. So let me turn to the first part of the challenge, Russia, and I don't want to go into detail here because I think this is known to everyone. Russia is no longer a status quo power in Europe. It seeks to revise the post-Cold War order and establish a sphere of influence and limit the sovereignty and strategic freedom of its neighbors. In Ukraine, of course, Russia has repeatedly used nuclear threats to constrain Western behavior, and the results have been mixed. We can say. More broadly, Russia's understanding of strategic deterrence is different from the Western usage of the term. It blends deterrence and compellence, integrates military and non-military means, and combines a variety of different tools. And within this broader framework, of course, nuclear weapons remain central. Russia appears willing to use nuclear threats as part of a revisionist strategy. And while Russia has not achieved all its objectives, as Western governments have gradually crossed several lines that initially seemed difficult to cross, and Ukraine has continued to resist, Russian nuclear signaling has had effects. It has contributed to caution, it has shaped the pace and scope of Western support, and it has reminded Europeans that nuclear coercion is once again part of the security environment on the continent. This does not mean, of course, that Russia is certain to attack NATO, nor does it mean that nuclear use is likely, but it does mean that Europe's deterrence posture must be credible enough to remove any temptation to test it. Now, the problem is that the second part of the challenge concerns the United States, in particular President Donald Trump. And here too, I want to be precise. So the argument our group put forward is not that the United States has already abandoned Europe, nor is it that US extended nuclear deterrence has suddenly become worthless. In fact, as I will discuss later, continued reliance on the United States remains, in the short to midterm, the most credible and feasible option available to Europeans. The problem is different. So extended deterrence is, as we all know, politically fragile by nature. It requires one state to convince an adversary that it is willing to run enormous risks, potentially existential risks, on behalf of another state or a group of states. It depends on capability, but also on institutions, interests, habits, trust, and political leadership. For decades, Europeans could treat US extended deterrence as a stable baseline that was never entirely risk-free, but it was plausible. Today, it is much harder to do so. And there are several reasons. One is what many Europeans perceive as domestic political instability in the United States. The second is the changing geography of US strategy, with growing attention to other parts of the world beyond Europe, and potentially simultaneous crises involving Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and possibly other actors. The third is what you could label the transactional turn in US alliance politics. And if security guarantees are increasingly framed as conditional, dependent on payments, concessions, or political alignment, then allies begin to worry and adversaries begin to calculate. And then finally, there's the broader erosion of transatlantic trust, in particular under this administration, because the president has repeatedly suggested that he might not be willing to defend US allies. The public opinion in Europe reflects this loss of trust, as figures from Michal Smetana and his co-authors at the Peace Research Center in Prague show. You can see them here. There was a notable decline after Trump's second inauguration. In the UK, Germany, and Poland, more people said that the US commitment to NATO was unreliable than reliable. In the UK, strikingly, only 28% said it was reliable in March 2026. And since then, numerous polls have corroborated these findings, and the figures have mostly become worse. In Germany, for instance, in January, only 15% of respondents in a major public opinion poll said that the United States was a trustworthy partner. And almost 2/3 said they worried a lot about the transatlantic partnership. And these are, of course, disturbing figures. Again, the issue is not certainty of abandonment. The issue is uncertainty. And there's a lot of uncertainty in Europe these days. In deterrence, that uncertainty matters. If Russia believes that the United States might hesitate or that Europe might be unable to act without Washington, that perception can create instability. And the very ambiguity that sometimes supports deterrence can, under certain conditions, also become a vulnerability. And this is the context in which we ask, what are Europe's options? Before turning to the 5 options, let me briefly explain how we evaluated them. So we focused on 2 broad criteria, credibility and feasibility. So credibility essentially asks whether a nuclear-armed adversary would believe that Europe has both the capability and the will to deny strategic gain or impose unacceptable costs. This involves, of course, military capabilities, but also command and control, survivability, escalation management, political decision-making, signaling, and institutions that make resolve believable. Feasibility asks whether an option could actually be implemented and sustained. Here we considered financial costs, legal constraints, political viability, and public support. So could governments fund the option? Would it be compatible with international law and alliance obligations? Could democratic governments sustain support over time? And the key point here is that credibility and feasibility are often in tension. The more credible an option becomes in military terms, the more demanding it often becomes financially and politically. And conversely, the options that look most feasible may leave Europe with less credible deterrence. And that trade-off runs through the entire report. And even if the group, as I mentioned, sometimes disagreed about specific assessments, all members share the general conclusions. So let me now turn to option A, doubling down on US extended nuclear deterrence. This remains the default option. It is the arrangement most European governments still prefer, and it's not difficult to see why. The US has unmatched nuclear capabilities, a broad and flexible nuclear arsenal, and conventional capabilities deeply integrated into NATO's deterrence posture. It has decades of experience with extended deterrence, and NATO has built dense institutional structures around US leadership. The Nuclear Planning Group, nuclear sharing, dual capable aircraft, joint exercises, and established consultation mechanisms. It is also financially and politically very attractive to European policymakers. So if the goal is to maintain credible deterrence in the short term, option A remains by far the strongest options. It has also a strong path-dependent logic. European forces, NATO planning, and transatlantic defense industrial cooperation have all developed around the assumption of US leadership. And replacing that structure would be extraordinarily difficult. But there's a problem. And the option that is most credible militarily is becoming more fragile politically. In many European publics, and we can go into more detail in the discussion, the judgment has become quite clear. They just do not think that the United States under Donald Trump is a fully credible ally. I do not think that I have to elaborate on all the examples that have led European publics and elites to question whether Donald Trump feels committed to NATO and whether he would really come to Europe's defense if push comes to shove. But clearly, European policymakers worry that the US administration might condition security guarantees on concessions. Now, some people say that even the Trump administration has been entirely clear when it comes to extended nuclear deterrence. If you talk to European officials, many will confirm that no US official has ever explicitly questioned a US extended nuclear deterrence in closed-door meetings in NATO, for instance. But we've also all heard Bridge Colby and others call on Europeans to assume the lion's share of the conventional burden and to think about the potentially incremental withdrawal of US troops from the continent. And of course, the link between conventional and nuclear deterrence is considered crucial by many Europeans. Extended nuclear deterrence does not float above the rest of the alliance. It is embedded in a broader posture. And if the United States were to become conventionally detached from Europe, as some people here fear, many Europeans worry that its nuclear guarantee would also become less credible. So the central assessment of option A is this. It remains the best short-term option, but it can just no longer be treated as a guaranteed baseline. So in that sense, Europe should therefore do two things at the same time. It should work to preserve US extended deterrence, but it should also, we believe, prepare for the possibility that the credibility of that deterrence erodes. That's not anti-American, it's just prudent from a European perspective. Now, option B is to increase the role of French and British forces in nuclear deterrence. This is probably the most frequently discussed European alternative to exclusive reliance on the United States. It's attractive because it builds on existing nuclear powers, does not require new nuclear weapon states, does not require a completely new European nuclear authority, and it could strengthen European agency while maintaining continuity with the existing nuclear order. The crucial question is, what exactly do we mean? There's a major difference here between a stronger French and British role that complements US extended deterrence and a French and British deterrent that replaces the United States. As a complement, option B is plausible and potentially useful. The UK assigns its nuclear forces to NATO, participates in the NPG. France remains outside NATO's command structures, nuclear command structures, and emphasizes strategic autonomy, but French doctrine has long included the idea that France's vital interests have a European dimension. In his recent speech on the deterrence, French President Macron again underlined this European dimension and invited European partners to intensify strategic dialogues and to French exercises, and suggested that French fighter jets could visit air bases in other European countries. All of this could matter. It could reassure allies, it could complicate Russian calculations, it could show that Europe is not entirely dependent on a single center of decision-making in Washington. But this should not be confused with replacing the United States. The French and British arsenals are limited, and extending deterrence is difficult. And even if they were willing, they would need enormous investments, more submarines, more warheads, additional delivery systems, possibly lower yield options, more robust command and control arrangements, and a much larger set of conventional enablers. They would also need new political and institutional mechanisms to consult with non-nuclear allies and to make their commitments credible. And then there's the question of sovereignty, of course. France, in particular, has a deeply rooted tradition of nuclear independence. And the idea of sharing decision-making authority over nuclear use is completely alien to Paris. So Macron's proposal for nuclear consultations remains strictly bilateral and is a far cry from NATO's culture of consultation in the multilateral nuclear planning group. In the UK, the challenge is different. So British nuclear forces are operationally sovereign, but they remain deeply dependent, of course, on cooperation with the United States, especially regarding Trident missiles. And they were also not designed for comprehensive extended deterrence across Europe. Both France and the UK lack the scale, flexibility, and counterforce capabilities of the United States. They cannot do damage limitation. And neither Paris nor London currently appears willing to assume the full risks of extended nuclear deterrence for all European allies without US backing. So option B is attractive as a hedge and as a complement. It may be the most realistic way to increase Europe's nuclear role in the near term, but it is not a simple substitute for US extended deterrence, even if many politicians suggest something along those lines. So a good way to summarize is this option B can help narrow a deterrence gap, but by itself, under current conditions, it cannot close the gap if the United States disappears. Option C is the development of the famous Euro deterrent. So a Euro deterrent is also a favorite in political circles in Europe, and it appears to solve the problem by internalizing the commitment. So if Europe had a common nuclear deterrent, then the defense of Europe would no longer depend on an external guarantor or on the national decision of one European nuclear power. It would be Europe defending itself. Conceptually, that is, of course, appealing, but the practical difficulties are enormous. So the first question, of course, is who would actually control the weapons? If launch authority remains entirely national, for example, with France or the UK, then this is not really a Euro deterrent. It is, in essence, option B. A true Euro deterrent would require some transfer or sharing of nuclear decision-making authority to a European body. But what body would that be? The European Council, a coalition of participating states, a new intergovernmental nuclear council, the European Commission, NATO without the United States. So each possibility raises serious questions of legitimacy, speed, secrecy, democratic control, and strategic credibility. Nuclear decision-making requires clarity. It requires survival, command, and control, an authority that adversaries believe can and will act under extreme pressure. And in democracies, it requires democratic legitimacy too. Europe does not currently have such an authority. There are also problems of political cohesion, law, and time. So European states obviously differ in threat perception, nuclear culture, constitutional constraints, domestic politics, and attitudes toward sovereignty. A Euro deterrent would also have to navigate the NPT, EU law, national constitutional law, and alliance obligations. And even if Europeans agreed politically, designing, funding, legitimizing, and operationalizing such a force would take many years, probably decades. So the hard part is not saying Europe needs a deterrent. The hard part is actually answering who decides, who pays, who hosts, who commands, who bears the risk, and who would actually push the button. Until those questions are discussed, let alone answered convincingly, the Euro deterrent remains more of an aspiration than a strategy. And it's highly unlikely that we will find convincing answers to all these questions that would be supported by the whole of Europe. That brings me to option D, the acquisition of new independent national nuclear arsenals by additional European states. There has been an ongoing, even if fringe, debate in Germany, but also in other countries such as Poland or some of the Nordic countries. The appeal, of course, of this option is sovereignty. A national nuclear arsenal would, in theory, free a state from dependence on external guarantees. And in particular in Germany, for instance, some people say that if we cannot trust the United States under Donald Trump, why should we trust the French if they may elect a president from the Rassemblement National? And we would end up in a similar situation. But the costs and risk of these options are immense. So developing, of course, nuclear weapons is not simply a matter of acquiring warheads. It requires fissile material, design expertise, testing, simulation, delivery systems, secure storage, safety, security systems, command and control, early warning, doctrine, training, and survivability. This does not mean it cannot be done, but most people suggest an option or a timeline that is just not credible. The timeline would be long, and during that period, the proliferating state would face intense diplomatic pressure and potentially new security risks. This might be different, of course, if the United States decided to support friendly proliferation, as some authors have suggested. But that would, I believe, contradict decades of US non-proliferation policy, in particular when it comes to Germany. Perhaps some of you would like to comment on this, but my understanding is that this isn't something anyone in the US would actually consider. The legal and political costs would also be enormous. The non-nuclear European states are all signatories to the NPT, National Nuclearization could fragment Europe politically and create new instability in a crisis. And more nuclear actors mean more command system, more doctrines, more risks of misperception, and more opportunities for escalation. And for these reasons, option D is not only difficult, it's also dangerous, we believe. It might become more tempting if confidence in US deterrence collapsed completely and if no European alternative emerged. But precisely because proliferation pressures could grow under such conditions, Europeans need to think now about how to avoid ending up there. In sum, option D is a reminder of what could happen if Europe fails to develop more credible collective solutions. New independent arsenals would likely be the result of a complete deterioration of European security institutions or bring it about. Finally, option E is to focus on conventional deterrence without any nuclear component. This option has intuitive appeal too, especially for those who are deeply uncomfortable with nuclear weapons. It essentially says Europe should invest massively in conventional capabilities, strengthen air and missile defense, develop conventional long-range strike capabilities, improve readiness, rebuild defense industrial capacity, and make itself conventionally strong enough to deter Russia. So the question here is not really whether Europe should strengthen conventional deterrence. It must. The question is whether conventional deterrence alone can substitute for nuclear deterrence. Our answer is probably not. And the reason is simple. Russia is a nuclear power. If Europe had no credible nuclear backing, Moscow might believe it could use nuclear threats to neutralize Europe's conventional superiority or to freeze a conflict on favorable terms. Conventional strength can, of course, reduce the likelihood of conflict, deny Russia quick gains, and improve resilience, but it cannot fully answer nuclear coercion, we believe. A purely conventional Europe might be very strong in many respects and still vulnerable to nuclear blackmail. And I'm not sure whether Europeans will prove as other Europeans will prove as resilient as the Ukrainians. This does not mean Europe should neglect conventional defense. On the contrary, conventional capabilities are indispensable. But they are not a complete substitute for nuclear deterrence in a world where Russia continues to rely on nuclear weapons as tools of strategy. Some might argue that the conventional buildup could be so massive as to have strategic or similar strategic effects than a nuclear deterrent, holding at risk a wide variety of Russian targets. But it appears unclear whether Europe could fund and produce the necessary quantities for such an arms buildup. So option E, in sum, is necessary as part of any broader strategy, but insufficient as a standalone answer. So if we step back from the individual options, what do we learn? So the most important lesson is that every option solves one problem and creates another. Option A, continued reliance on the United States, is the most credible and feasible in the short term, but it leaves Europe vulnerable to political uncertainty in Washington. Option B, a stronger French and British role, is the most plausible European hedge, but it cannot easily replace the United States and would require major changes in doctrine, capabilities, and political commitment. Option C, a Euro deterrent, is attractive in theory because it addresses the credibility problem of extended deterrence, but it runs into enormous institutional, political, legal, and operational obstacles. Option D, new national arsenals, maximizes sovereign control, but at the price of proliferation, fragmentation, high costs, and major instability. Option E, conventional deterrence only, is essential but insufficient against nuclear coercion. And here you can see figure 10 from our report that discusses these various dimensions in more detail. And this is why the report concludes that Europe has no good options. But we believe that that conclusion should not lead to fatalism. It should rather lead to seriousness. The problem with much of the European debate is that it oscillates between denial and fantasy. Denial says the current arrangement will hold, so we do not need to think about alternatives. Fantasy says there must be a simple European solution if only we were bold enough. Both are dangerous. The current arrangement may hold, but it may also weaken. European alternatives are possible, but none is simple. So what we believe Europe needs is not a series of bold proposals. It needs a strategy for managing the trade-offs here. That likely means pursuing several tracks in parallel. And the good news here is that the options I outlined here are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So Europe should keep the United States engaged for as long as possible. It should strengthen NATO's nuclear posture and consultation mechanisms. It should increase the credibility of the French and British contribution. It should build the conventional enablers that any deterrence posture requires. It should invest in strategic literacy, public debate, and institutional capacity. And it should quietly study more ambitious options, even those that are politically unattractive today, because they may become relevant under worse conditions. This is not about rushing toward nuclearization. It is about avoiding panic later. So let me conclude. A deterrence gap is not inevitable, but it is possible. And it can emerge not only from material weakness, but from political ambiguity, institutional underdevelopment, and also strategic complacency. So Europe's challenge, we believe, is therefore not simply to acquire more capabilities. It is to develop a credible political military posture for a world in which nuclear weapons have become more important again and are likely to become even more important. As I try to explain here, Europe has no good options, but the absence of good options does not absolve Europeans from responsibility. On the contrary, it makes responsibility more urgent. And no one, this is the consensus in the group, no one will solve these issues for us. There will be no deterrence ex machina. The worst outcome for us Europeans would be for us Europeans to continue as if the old assumptions still held, only to discover in a crisis that the political foundations of deterrence had eroded, that institutions were underdeveloped, that capabilities were missing, and that the debate had never moved beyond slogans. And that is what we try to argue against with this report. We do not claim to have found the answer. We do not argue that Europe should immediately choose one option and discard the others. But we do argue that Europeans must move beyond declaratory ambitions and engage seriously with the trade-offs, constraints, and risks of all options on the table. Our report is clearly just a first step in this debate, not more, but also not less, I think. Thank you for that. I'm looking forward to the discussion.